Today is August 27th, 2020. My guest is Robert Chitester. Bob is an educational entrepreneur and filmmaker who has spent most of his career creating video resources to help people understand market economies and the power of economic liberty. With Milton and Rose Friedman, he created the acclaimed PBS series Free to Choose. He created the Idea Channel, an archive of over 200 interviews with leading scholars, including F.A. Hayek, Norman Borlaug, Thomas Sowell, and James Buchanan. He created IZZIT, I-Z-Z-I-T, IZZIT.org, which produces resources for teachers in the classroom. Bob, welcome to EconTalk.
It's a delight to be here, Russ, and compliment you on your ongoing efforts with EconTalk. Very important.
Thank you. Do what I can. You began your career in public television. How did you end up working with Milton Friedman?
Oh, boy. Well, I'm going to try to keep my answers as short as possible, but I want to start, though, with me in college. I enrolled at the University of Michigan in their engineering department because in high school, I was sharp enough that, for example, in algebra, I could mainly figure out what the answers were. But I wasn't disciplined enough to learn the process. So my first blue book, and I was great in chemistry and physics and all that. So the professor who taught those, he urged me, oh, Bob, you should be an engineer, this, that, and the other thing. I didn't have much understanding of what an engineer might be. So I entered the University of Michigan as an engineer, and my first algebra blue book put the end to that. I know I had the lowest score in the class. It was like a 40 or 41 or something. And I knew that I didn't have a clue what the process of algebra was. So I had a scholarship from the Navy. Had I not had that scholarship, I might have transferred to the music school because my dream up until I was 30 years old was that I wanted to be the next Bing Crosby. And I finally got rid of that unrealistic assumption. But the important thing was then, so I had to pick a curriculum to move to, and the Navy would not allow me to go into music. I guess they understood that wouldn't be of great help out there on the destroyer or whatever. So I chose radio and television just because I thought, well, if I'm going to have a musical career, I'm going to be singing on radio and TV, so I may as well study that. I mean, it's just crazy, Russ, how I ended up. But basically what it did was, and it took a while, not too long, but to understand the artistic creative bent that was inside me, which has made all the difference in terms of the projects I've undertaken. And the results from them, as Peter Boettke, and I was always so gratified that Peter felt this way. The Friedmans would disagree with him. He maintains to this day that Free to Choose is a better book than Capitalism and Freedom because it is more accessible. That because it's the transcripts of the TV show converted into a book, the average reader can get more out of it than they can out of Capitalism and Freedom, which is a little bit heavier trip.
Yeah, it's definitely a more demanding read. I have recommended both books at various times to different types of people. Obviously, they're both worth reading, but they're very different. I'm not going to weigh in on which one's better. But no. And in effect, it's a silly way to approach it because they both have their role. And from my point of view, I'd love to have everybody read both of them. But it might very well be that they start with Free to Choose and then go to Capitalism and Freedom. When we do our events at Kapitoff, the Friedman's summer home in Vermont, we assign readings and we discuss chapters from both books. So how did you come to work with Milton and Rose on that TV series, which was the genesis for the book? And The book actually came out before the series went on the air, but the book was preceded by the filming and those transcripts.
Yeah. Well, before I ever became an entity in the freedom movement that people would recognize in any way, I followed up on my radio and TV. I came from the university to, I did 2 years in Saginaw setting up a system in high school, but I came to this area to work with what was then a state teachers college, and was immediately thrown into the mix of people here in Erie who were working to bring an educational television station to Erie. And through the fact that I was the only one in the entire group, they were mainly educators. The superintendent of Erie County Superintendent of Schools was in the group. I essentially became the expert by default. And when it came time to hire a general manager, the president of the board of directors of the group that held the license said, gee, we better go look for a general manager. And I said, well, I agree with you, but I'm going to recuse myself because I'm going to apply. And his answer was, oh, well, then you got the job.
How old were you?
So literally, I was handed the job of building a public television station, which I succeeded at great cost. I was clinically depressed for about 2-3 years afterwards because I had pushed so hard to get it done. So I ran that station for 16 years. Now,
how old were you when you started, Bob?
Oh, gosh, I have to be careful there, but I was in my late 20s.
Okay.
So I took on building this TV station, never having done any of that, and I succeeded. But then I also, and this, of course, everybody today knows that Bob never hesitates to share his ideas or to tell you what he thinks. And so I became involved in the politics of PBS at the national level. And I'm from this tiny little station in Erie, but I go to these events and I engage in the debate over what our policies should be. I admit to one thing: people think of me, they think, oh, well, you were probably liberal and then you became conservative. No, not my track. I am an individualist. I recognized that very early in life, even in high school. But I did vote for McGovern. And I did so because of the dust-up over communications. Because Nixon was, thinking, well, we're going to censor public television, do this and that. So I was very involved and outspoken. The reason why that's relevant to get us to Milton Friedman was I also then was ambitious. So I persuaded a local businessman to sponsor an activity in Erie called the National Symposium on Science and Technology. And that was my effort to counter the Back to Earth movement that was going on in the late 60s, 70s, and the rejection of technology. And I managed to bring to Erie a fairly high-level group of people. The mayor came to our dinner in the evening, and he said, I've never seen so many corporate jets at the airport. Now, that was because I was introduced to Ed David, who was at one point head of the National Science, something or other. But he introduced me to another number of people, and W. Allen Wallace was one of them. W. Allen Wallace at that time was chancellor of the University of Rochester. And he was also chairman of the board of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And it was a fascinating meeting, because Alan couldn't believe there was a public TV station manager who held the views I did. And I had not paid much attention to the hierarchy at CPB. And I was astonished that now I'm dealing with the guy who's the chairman of the organization that hands out grants to public TV stations. Galbraith's series goes on the air in the mid-70s.
John Kenneth Galbraith.
Yep. and he did a series tied to his book, The Age of Uncertainty. And I, by then, have established a relationship with Alan Wallace, and I made it clear to him. I said, boy, this is too bad that there's not a response to this. What they did do was they stuck people for about 5 minutes at the end of each of the programs to do a counter statement to whatever Galbraith had said. From a communications point of view, that was a throwaway. It accomplished nothing. So Alan agreed that there ought to be something, and I said, I've got some ideas. He said, well, share them with me. I put together a little, on a pad, some ideas. He said, okay. And I'm sitting in his office, and he picks the phone up and calls Milton Friedman. Now, I have to admit that I'm not sure I knew who Milton Friedman was at that point in time. But within a 5-minute phone call, Alan persuaded Milton to meet with me in January of 1977. Milton had retired from the university, mandatory retirement at 65.
University of Chicago.
Right, University of Chicago, and had won the Nobel Prize in 76. So he agreed, and he said, well, when we get back from Stockholm, we're going into a sublet apartment in San Francisco, and Bob can meet us there. And that's how I got to meet Milton and Rose.
And the concept, for people who haven't seen it, how did each episode work? What was the way that the series was organized? How many parts was it? Do you remember? I want to say 16?
It was 10 hours.
10 hours, okay.
Yeah. And the model in my mind, by the way, not in terms of content, but in terms of feel, in terms of style, was Jacob Bronowski's Ascent of Man. And on the other hand, Milton, and he was a quick learn, but early on, he didn't have much sense of he'd been on a lot of TV talk shows, but had no sense of what it would take to do a major series. So he got this idea. He said, Bob, Harcourt Brace Jovanovich is going to publish the book associated with this. And they've also agreed, they like the idea, and they're going to put up $150,000 so that I can do a total of 15 lectures across the country, and you will, with your remote van, record those presentations and the Q&A. And he said, then you can just stick pictures on there, and that'll be the TV series. Well, yeah, I thought illustration was the best way to counter that, so I didn't push hard. About five of those lectures in, Milton kind of sheepishly looks me in the eye and said, well, Bob, you were right. I can see this ain't going to work the way I had in mind, and now I'm stuck having to do 10 more lectures. Those 15 lectures are available. Milton Speaks. They're available on our website, and they are interesting in that they're like, and part of my strategy and everything is leverage. You do a TV series, and you make it as exciting and interesting, and lots of stories and people in. And what's your goal? Well, your goal is then to get them to read the book. And if you can get them to read the book, then maybe they'll also watch one or more of those lectures. That you look at your effort in a project way, not a TV series. A TV series plus this, plus this, plus this, plus this, to gain the leverage.
So he gave those lectures, but that was not the only thing, even though he changed maybe his style. So how does an episode unfold when you in the finished product?
Well, in the finished product, first of all, we the very first night that I met with Milton, we talked about my background, what I'd done, what I hadn't done, and I made it very clear to him that I was proposing to undertake something that I had never done, and that was in my mind at the top of the documentary game. meaning expensive to do, wide-ranging in terms of subject matter. So with that in mind, and Milton, in that early discussion, before he and Rose had agreed to do it, I pointed out to them, I said, Milton, here's some things I've done. And I said, I'm happy to share with you. I'd done a swimming meet for ESPN, and I'd done some concerts out of Chautauqua, etc. And I said, so I have done things, but we're going to go and hire the best documentary maker we can find in the world. So, and my goal and my role for you is to ensure that in the role of executive producer, I have the ultimate say as to what happens, and I can then guarantee what goes on the screen is what you want, not what the producer wants on the screen. Because in these kinds of situations, obviously producers are creative, and they are not above wanting to insert their perspective in the creative process. Well, as executive producer, then I can step in and say, hey, nope, that's not going to happen. Milton wants it this way. We also arranged that Rose would be associate producer, which was a kind of an unusual arrangement. So now I have a producer, I have Milton and Rose as a team, and how they did it was the following. First of all, we sketched out what the 10 programs would in general cover. And the points, the critical points that Milton wanted to make on equality, on the markets, etc. Then the producer and his team, they go to work to come up with ideas of where do we tell these stories? What examples can we find? And when you watch the series, you'll see we go to India and we show Milton he goes to a small village and he's standing there by the hand weavers and able to talk. He's in Fennell market in Boston buying tomatoes and talking about the marketplace that way. So the producer and his team of people, they're identifying where they think they can do each of the segments in the hour program. I'm sorry, I want to be clear. The documentaries were only a half hour long. And then there was the half-hour debate following. But the documentaries then were all laid out in terms of, okay, we're going to start here. We're going to end up in India. We're going to do some taping in Greece. We're going to do this. And then how does it happen when they're actually there? And this is the difference. This is what sets Milton apart. There was no script. There was no written script. So that when he got to that Indian village, he had already, it had been written out and he was going to memorize it or something. Well, you can imagine no way would Milton do that. And so what they did was every night he and Mike Latham and Rose would sit down together and say, all right, tomorrow here's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be going to this hand weaver. And by the way, Milton, here are the 2 or 3 key points that you wanted to make with regard to that story. And they'd go out and shoot it, ad lib.
Yeah. And Mike Latham was the director?
He was the producer.
The producer.
Yeah, actually producer director. I think he held both roles.
So I'm not surprised he'd improvise. He was pretty good on his feet. You know, I took his last class at the University of Chicago in 1976 when I was a first-year grad student. He offered a non-credit class for first-year grad students. And what he would do, and we all took it because, of course, what he would do is he'd stand in the front of the class and we'd ask him questions. And I don't know if I've ever told the story in EconTalk before, but I'll tell it again if I have, which is that at the University of Chicago, at the end of your first year, you have to pass an exam that's not pro forma. It's pretty tough about 2/3 of the people failed the exam. So they would let in a lot more people than they expected to graduate, and it was weeding out.
Is this specifically an econ?
Yeah, this is the core. We called it the core.
Yeah.
It was called the core exam. And when you got to Chicago in graduate school, a lot then, I don't know what it's like now, but then the first thing you did is you went to the office of the department and you bought a Xerox of all the past exams, so you could start studying for what was coming 8 or 9 months later. So people had varying degrees of stress about that and prep.
I would guess,
as you might expect. But what we would do is we'd ask Milton questions off that exam that we couldn't answer, and he would answer them on his feet. It was a comfort to us. He didn't answer them all easily. Many of them, of course, were questions that didn't, quote, have a right answer per se. They were very open-ended, but we enjoyed that. And in the beginning of that class, fairly early on, he won the Nobel Prize. It was a pretty exciting time. But he was very quick on his feet. But I want you to talk about what made him such an effective communicator. I think you could say he was one of the two great economic communicators of the 20th century. You could argue Keynes was another great one. Mm-hmm. But Milton had some unusual abilities, one of which he was very quick on his feet. But what else do you think was valuable to him? What made him so effective?
Well, I'm going to answer that, and if I have it here in my pile of things, I'm going to read you a poem. But my answer to that is his inexhaustible curiosity. Mm-hmm. And what that does is that in any conversation, exchange with anyone, Milton very quickly, in most cases, makes it clear to the other person that they're important. And as a result, you end up with an environment in which you have a natural, spontaneous discussion. No pretension, no games being played. And when Milton asks you a question, you don't have the feeling that he's just doing it pro forma to be nice, but that he truly does have an interest in who you are and what your interests are. And what that does is also creates a situation in which he then, and he often did, can play on those interests in relating a point with regard to economics, and by doing so in an area that you are already comfortable in. It's an area that's part of your life. Therefore, he has the opportunity to give you an example about, private property cost, opportunity cost, whatever issue he wanted to share with you, but he does it in the context of subject matter that you're familiar and comfortable with. And of course, that's a powerful, powerful tool in terms of getting people to consider your ideas.
Now, you mentioned that after the 30 minutes of Milton standing in a village in India, having spoken about, say, hand weaving, there was the last hour of the Free to Choose series. Each episode was, quote, a debate. What was the nature of that?
Well, the nature of that was, and by the way, that idea came up from the Brits, from Michael Latham. I failed to mention, Michael was with the BBC. We worked with a group in Britain that agreed to hire him away from the BBC, give him other work after he did Free to Choose, because otherwise he would not have wanted to give up his situation at the BBC. And so it was Michael who came to me fairly early in our process and said, Bob, I think we ought to, initially we were thinking of doing 10 one-hour documentaries. And Michael said, no. He said, look, this is a master of debate. Milton he is heads and shoulders above anybody else. We should take advantage of that, which we did. And then, but there was an interesting dimension to it. the Brits were very used to paying people to be on those panels. That's not something, at least at that time in my career, that we did. So Michael and I had an interesting debate about that. He said, well, Bob, I feel I should offer these people some money. And I said, no. So we finally agreed that if somebody asked, it was okay if he negotiated a price for their participation, but that he wasn't going to offer to anybody. But the people who participated were wide-ranging. We'd get somebody, I think the woman who was head of the Pennsylvania Consumer Protection, we had her on there. Then we had Francis Fox Piven, whom Tom Sowell had this brilliant exchange with. So it was a wide-ranging group. And then we hired Robert McKenzie, who was with the CBC, to be the moderator. And I think that somewhat worked. I think my memory is that Milton and I thought we might have had a better moderator, but it worked out all right.
So you
Milton
mentioned
was brilliant.
Yeah, he incredibly quick. You mentioned his empathy or his conveying of taking you seriously as an intellectual adversary, which he did. I think there are two other parts of his skill set, and I encourage listeners and viewers to go watch and listen to Milton in action online. There are a lot of great videos that you have up on your website, Bob, that we'll link to. Well, one of the things that I thought there were two pieces to his repertoire that made him so effective as a communicator. Obviously, he was a great, simple stylist as a writer. He wrote incredibly clearly. He wrote. He was a good storyteller. But there were two, I thought, character traits of his that were very effective. One is that he always smiled. If you watch him eviscerate people on some of those videos intellectually, he always did it with a smile. So that made him, I think, more sympathetic to third parties watching the conversations. He was never angry. He's never mean-spirited. He was always smiling. And he did this, by the way, and I've said this before on the program, but I think it's important to emphasize it here. It's hard to remember how much he was in the intellectual wilderness as a young man. And a lot of people who go through that experience end up bitter. They have a chip on their shoulder. They struggle to relate to people who disagree with them. And Milton, for whatever reason, probably genetic, but maybe I know he also worked at it based on what you've written about him. He decided or was able to stay calm despite the fact that he was viewed with disdain by many, not just disagreed with him, but had no respect for him. And that was true, by the way, in his scholarship. I'm going to add that as well, because when he first started suggesting that inflation was a monetary phenomenon and only a monetary phenomenon, he was viewed with great criticism and mocked. And he stayed strong, but not just stayed strong in his views. He stayed strong without becoming embittered or defensive or cruel. And so one of his skills was that demeanor, that cheerful demeanor, which I think was extremely effective with objective observers who didn't have a horse in the race, an axe to grind. The other thing is that, and this is fun for me because of my intellectual journey, he didn't convey any doubt. He was extremely self-confident, as if his views were so obviously true. Not in an arrogant way. He didn't come across as arrogant, but he never conveyed any uncertainty. And as I've gotten older, as listeners and viewers know, I'm obsessed with the challenge of knowing what we know. Milton never conveyed that. He was very sure of himself, but not in an arrogant way. And he had plenty to be arrogant about. He was a Nobel Prize winner. His intellect was extraordinary. He was successful in the academy and in the public sphere, but he didn't. He was able to maintain the common touch, as Kipling says.
Absolutely right.
So react to that. What are your thoughts on those points?
Well, I want to go back to the very point you started with, which is how does someone endure and remain positive and upbeat the attacks that are directed at one?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the United States has, unfortunately, but we should accept the fact that in a democracy, in a free market capitalist society, where you vote to establish the government, that you are going to have. Politics is always going to be a brutal game. Yep. It didn't take very long before Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans were fully prepared to vilify our first president. So there's a huge question of how they survive. Well, I actually started a project, and we recorded, I think maybe as much as 20 hours of material that I was calling the Chicago Five. And I reflect back to George Will's comment when the Soviet Union fell, when I think he said the University of Chicago won, the Soviet Union lost. I narrow it down. It was Milton Friedman who won, in the sense that he was predisposed. He liked the engagement. He loved the interaction. Whereas somebody like George Stigler just would not, he didn't want any part of any of that kind of public kinds of chess game. And Milton just relished it. But he also had refuge. And I want to share two things. One, W. Allen Wallace, George Stigler, Milton entered the University of Chicago to start work on their master's degree in the same year. From that point until their death, they were the tightest of friends. When Allen Wallace died, Stigler died first. When Stigler died, Milton revealed to me, he said, "Bob, now there's only two musketeers." There were three musketeers. Now, I then added to that Rose and her brother, Aaron Director.
Sure.
And in my mind, it was that group of four people that were critical to Milton having a place he could go where he could get some relief, some sense, as well as they were tough on him.
Sure.
I had dinner at their home in Sea Ranch with just the four of us, Aaron Director, Rose, Milton, and me. And this was far enough along in our relationship that I did participate a bit. Early on, I would not have said probably a word. But I would say that at least three times, maybe four, maybe five, we're chatting along, and then Aaron would say, "Milton, you're just a statist." And they'd engage in a discussion, debate, so that Milton had a chance. He had this place where he could go, reliable people. He knew that they would be honest with him with regard to issues that were important. And I think that made a huge difference in his ability to sustain over, I don't know, what was it, Russ, 20, 25 years before he started to have many helpers in the field. Yeah. He was just a lone soldier.
He was a bit of a statist in that he was much more pragmatic, I think, than many of the philosophical comrades in the movement of liberty.
I use an example of Marshall Fritz, in that Marshall wrote at least one little paper, if not, I don't know that he wrote a book, but Milton wrote some forward to it, which I read, and it was very complimentary of Marshall's. And Marshall Fritz's goal was to go back to the early 1800s and get government totally out of schools. So Milton writes a little endorsement of that, but he never pursued that.
No.
I think he fully understood that was a step too far in terms of what might be practical within his lifetime. So instead, he pulls back to school choice
vouchers,
and what others would think of as compromise.
Yeah. But I want to go back to your point about his character and his personality. I never thought about this. I was making the point earlier that he was always smiling.
Yeah.
I always thought it was a strategic aspect of him. I thought part of his demeanor in those conversations was simply strategic. That he'd be more effective if he was smiling. But I think you've hit on something that I think I never really thought about enough, which is that he just was enjoying himself.
Absolutely.
He loved sparring intellectually for its own sake. It was I think he just delighted in it, and it was great fun for him. It was never, here I am being attacked. There's footage online where people are so cruel to him, and his reaction is just, okay, so you've brought your queen out, and now I'm going to respond with my knight. And you're going to have to move your queen back. Yeah. It wasn't like, oh my gosh, I'm being attacked, which is a human response. But he would often just keep smiling. But I think it's because he enjoyed it. I never thought about that.
And Russ, he enjoyed everything.
Yeah.
And he did things with gusto.
Yeah.
We're visiting Kapitoff. My son, Mark, at that time was maybe 10 years old. And we were there for 3 days this was in 78, 79. We were near the end and starting to worry about marketing and such. So we're there at Kapitoff.
That's his house. Milton, that's his house in Vermont.
That's right. His summer house in Vermont, which he and Rose built. They had a pond on the property, and they had a canoe on it. Well, we're having discussions up at the house, and Milton says to Mark, "Hey, Mark, would you like to go in the canoe? Go down and play around with the canoe?" "Oh, sure." So we go barreling out of the house, jump into his Blazer, and he tears down over the hill. I thought he was going to roll us right into the pond. He was so excited and enthusiastic about it. And that's what I witnessed about almost every interaction he had with anybody. It had this excitement about life. And it's one of the things I try to convey to students or anybody. Milton Friedman, and I don't know how to describe it, but the whole idea of what markets mean opened my eyes in a way. I mean, it was just like a totally different world for me once I began to understand the role of markets and the enormous amount of information that's in front of you every second of your life. And I think that was something Milton just instinctively also was constantly sucking in data just from ordinary interactions. And just hugely enthusiastic in doing it.
You may be able to settle a question I don't know the answer to, I've never heard discussed, which is when I went to grad school at Chicago in '76, there was a popular T-shirt for sale, or that somebody made available, of Milton Friedman walking down a street in Hyde Park with George Stigler.
Yeah.
George Stigler was like, I'm guessing maybe 6'5".
Yeah.
And Milton was probably 5'4".
Oh,
maybe?
Less than that, 5'3" or 2 even, maybe.
Yeah. And they were young. They were both at their maximum height in this photograph.
Yeah,
but
right. You're right.
But they also, I think, didn't they play tennis?
Oh, my, yes. Oh, Milton loved tennis.
So you're talking about his enthusiasm. I'd love to see a video of of one of their tennis matches. But my question is, do you know who was the usual winner in those matches? Because although Milton would have a disadvantage in leverage of being 5'3" or so, I would think his competitive nature might help make up some of that gap. Do you have any idea how they did?
I don't have specific evidence. But I do know this. He certainly was confident in his ability as a tennis player, because I managed to get him to come to Erie maybe 3, 4, 5 times during the course of our activity together for various reasons, both to show the flag, so to speak, so people didn't think I was I can't believe Chitester's really working with this Nobel Prize winner, and to make sure that they realized that we were going ahead. And Milton then said, Bob, could you arrange for me to play tennis while I'm there? And I did. I got a hold of somebody who belonged to a tennis club that was fairly close to where our offices were. And then Milton said, and go to Kmart, I think at that point, and buy me some tennis shoes. Well, I had no idea what to buy, but I went and bought the shoes. And he went and he played, and I talked to the people afterwards. Now, they never talked about score, but they said, oh, yeah, he's a really good player.
Yeah, I'm sure it was ferocious. Would be my main.
Oh, yeah. I think so.
Yeah, just as he would be in everything that he wanted to explore and experience, for sure.
Ferocious, but not mean-spirited.
Yeah. No, he would not be a dirty player. He would be he'd be a happy warrior.
Very happy warrior.
So I talked earlier about his self-confidence, and I don't know if I've ever told this story, but after he was on EconTalk in 2006, and I think I was the last, as far as I know, I was the last person to interview him. We talked about a bunch of things, but one of the things we talked about was monetary policy. And I told him, I said, Milton, you made this claim during the conversation. I went back and looked at the data, and I'm not so sure that relationship between money supply and what might have been nominal GDP at the time, I can't remember, but so it looks doesn't look as clear cut as you claimed. And he wrote back and he said, you're looking at the wrong data. And he sent me a spreadsheet. He wanted, he had a different definition. I can't remember, it was M3 or M4 or M2, some different measure of money. But here was this man in his 90s still sending me a spreadsheet. It was, he cared a lot about truth. And, but as I said, he was very confident. His views on monetary policy didn't change much over his lifetime. We're in the 50th anniversary of his 1970 New York Times Sunday Magazine article, where he argues that the social responsibility of business is to make money, make profit within the letter of the law, of course, without fraud and deception. So I don't think he changed that, his views on that. Is there anything that you were aware of during his lifetime that he either came to reconsider or recant or admit some uncertainty about even?
I have a very, very significant answer to that. A quick footnote. I had occasion to also ask Hayek that question. What mistake did he make in life? You might find it interesting. He said, my advocacy of one government world.
One world government.
One world government. That apparently he, at least in the early stages of his career, thought that was a good idea. Until he said, I came to the recognition that if it was one world government, it means there was only going to be one, and it could be a dictatorship, it could be whatever.
Yeah, you need competition.
And it needed competition. Well, in Milton's case,
that was Hayek.
Yeah, that was Hayek. In Milton's case, it was quite different. And it related to Hong Kong and China. In that Milton, and from the very beginning, the mantra that I picked up from Milton instantly was economic, personal, political freedom are a package. You cannot separate them. If you try to separate them, you're not going to end up with the results that you want.
Yep.
So his prediction that when China liberalized in the economic area, he was, of course, convinced that that would lead to a liberalization in both personal and political freedom. And we were talking about why we had seen, quote, success of free market capitalism, and yet government sizes kept growing, et cetera, et cetera. But in the context of that, he said, well, in the case of China and Hong Kong, he said, I did not realize, and I had to come to it, that without rule of law, it would not happen. That rule of law has to be the fourth ingredient. Economic, personal, political freedom can only, you will only end up with all of them if you have rule of law. One law applies to everybody. And of course, that's not what the case is with Beijing and China. And now they're taking over Hong Kong. And by the way, I think Milton would, well, he was surprised, say the last year of his life, he was surprised that Beijing hadn't clamped down on Hong Kong already.
Yeah. Yeah, it's taken longer than I thought, too.
Yeah, he was amazed it lasted that long.
When I interviewed Milton in 2006, and of course those interviews are still available. We'll link to them. You can find them in our archive. You can Google them and find them. And we transcribe those online as well. Before we were regularly transcribing EconTalk. Now we do that as well for every episode. But I went back and I read Capitalism and Freedom, and the first part of that interview is about capitalism and freedom. And I told Milton I was struck by how many of the ideas in that book, which were extremely radical when he wrote about them in 1962, and some of them he'd been writing about before, how many of them had become mainstream. He argues for private social security, he argues for flexible exchange rates, he argues for a volunteer army, he argues to get rid of price supports for agriculture. He has a huge menu of things he would get rid of corporate subsidies. He has a huge menu of policy proposals, which at the time were viewed as ridiculous, impossible, vouchers being another one, school vouchers. And virtually every one of those ideas either happened or entered the intellectual debate. So he didn't win, but they became, at least, they were on the table. He at the time said it wasn't so much his doing, but we're not going to talk about that.
Yeah.
But when I mentioned that to him, his reaction surprised me. He said, actually, I'm struck by how few of them have actually been successful. The volunteer army is the most obvious one. It's a radical, incredibly radical idea. Famous exchange, I think it was with General Westmoreland, who said, I don't want a volunteer army. I don't want my country defended by mercenaries. And Milton said, better mercenaries than slaves. Right. Fighting against the coercive power of the draft. Now, I don't know if Milton was right about that, but he did win that debate. But his reaction at the time, in 2006, was basically, I was mostly a failure. Most of these ideas we've made no progress on. We've made no progress on agricultural price supports, corporate subsidies, Social Security, more personal responsibility. Vouchers are only an occasional experiment. The public school system remains very strong, and so on and so on. I'm curious about your having been in the trenches with Milton. What are your thoughts on that? I have something of a pessimistic, quixotic feeling as well, that despite our best efforts,
I totally agree.
We've had very little impact. Very little impact.
I agree with Milton's assessment, and it's a huge frustration to me as I close out my career, that somehow the movement has not been able to marshal better arguments for any and all of those. To me, they are still solidly useful ideas in terms of how to deal with very critical public policy issues. Now, the only thing that I can report in terms of, and in this instance, it's not a direct correlation, but in the broader sense of why did the collapse of the Soviet Union, why did the initial liberalization of China in terms of the economy, why, in spite of all that, if you look at the size of governments around the world, they have grown exponentially since the Berlin Wall came down, and our ability to stop the growth of government seems to be close to zero. It just keeps going on and on and on. And in discussing this with Milton, I said the only answer I can come up with in terms of why is that the case, and it is this egalitarian streak in human beings.
Very powerful.
It is powerful, and we did a TV public TV special called Work and Happiness, and in the initial development of it, I held the position that, well, we're going to look at welfare, so we should look at the value and importance of private welfare, and that was a better way to go at the problem. Phil Harvey, who is very involved in it, and he wrote a book or related to it, he disagreed with that, and he persuaded me, changed my whole perspective. And I don't know why it took me so long to come to this conclusion, that if you have a free society in which people are electing their government, you will have a government safety net, period. That I think human nature is such that the temptation to use the power to tax, the power to be able to take away money in order to provide that safety net, it will be a temptation too great for the populace to ignore, and therefore our goal should always be focusing on, and this is the pragmatic kind of approach that Milton would take, on structuring that welfare program to reduce the amount, to ensure the maximum return, the maximum achievement of your goal, which is to bail people out when they need it, but have a structure in which they can get out quickly. And it's that emergency support they need when the world has collapsed around them, but you don't structure it. And as you know, economists know, my gosh, the effective tax on somebody who leaves welfare and takes a minimum wage job is what, 120% or something. I mean, well, you can't expect people to make that kind of sacrifice.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because one of the things I didn't mention in Milton's list of policy preferences, of course, which I should have, is the negative income tax, which is his idea that we would eliminate the complex welfare systems that implicitly tax effort and have that effect you're talking about, and replace it with a single program. And of course, that idea is now on the table as a universal, so-called universal basic income. And just one more idea that's in the mainstream.
That's right.
Let me give you a more optimistic take on the freedom movement. Of course, one idea for why we failed isn't the egalitarian streak; it's that we're just wrong. We're just wrong about how the world works. We can't persuade people about it because we're not right. The facts aren't on our side, and so on. Now, I'm gonna, with all my epistemological humility, I want to reject that, at least for the purposes of this conversation, and propose a different aspect of the problem, which is that there's an enormous difference between the Soviet Union and, say, a Sweden. Sometimes they both get called socialist. It's a fundamental abuse of the word, or at least it's not a very helpful use of the word, because in one of them, the means of production, the allocation of workers, the salaries of people, allocate who got to live where, was totally controlled by a centralized state that was fundamentally corrupt, and was corrupt whether it was because it was socialist or communist doesn't matter. It was corrupt because it had no competition, and it inevitably brought out the worst in people, which Hayek warned us about in The Road to Serfdom in the chapter Who Rises to the Top. It's just a natural problem. And so I think it is by looking at the size of government as a measure of the success of Friedman and others, maybe we're making a fundamental error. What's happened, and I'm prompted to this partly by your earlier remark that that Chicago won the Cold War, or Milton won the Cold War. And I'd throw in Hayek as well, and by Mises and the socialist calculation debate, that they won the intellectual argument about whether markets work better than top-down allocation of all resources. And then they won the practical argument because the people in the Soviet Union didn't live so well. And Milton would have emphasized that. In that 2006 interview, he said, "Oh, I didn't persuade people that inflation's caused by money. New Zealand did, because when they stopped printing it, inflation went down." And so he was very much a pragmatist in that way. But my point is that I think you can make the argument that it's true that government continues to grow, but it grows in a very different way than it would have grown had Milton and others not made the case the way that they did. And in particular, it grows in the safety net sense, but the interventionist top-down folks, whether they're well motivated, as they often are, or not, as they sometimes are, they have made little or no headway in allocating resources generally, meaning what businesses do, what products are created. And I often make the point that, as depressing as you and I might find it, that the size of government not only hasn't shrunk, it's all we've done is maybe have it grow a little more slowly, and lately not so much. It's still the case that a person of creativity and enterprise can flourish in America in a way that they can't elsewhere. And that's because we still let people get fabulously rich if they produce something great, and lose all their money when they don't produce something great. And I just want to add just one more thing, because I think it's important, given that we're talking about Milton's legacy. Milton always liked to say that capitalism is a profit and loss system, not just a profit system. It's a profit and loss system, and that it's really important to let businesses fail. And had Milton been alive in 2008 and 9 when the bailouts occurred, he would have been the most eloquent opponent of those bailouts. And it's a tragedy to me that we did not have a voice as eloquent and powerful as his, intellectually and in terms of communication ability, to make that case.
I would agree with that, other than I want to reference your discussion with Glenn Lowry and say, I agree with that, but it bothers me that this arrow of history is headed down some roads that could be devastating to this country. And are we sensitive to what's going on? I mean, you and Glenn certainly were.
Yeah, we're in a minority right now.
That's right. And recognize how critically important this is, and begin to mount some type of response that could be effective.
Well, I think part of the problem is you mentioned the egalitarian urge of human beings, which Hayek traces back to the family. Walter Williams, I often quote him, he says the family's a socialist institution. And I always like to point out we were raised in that socialist institution, every one of us almost.
Yeah.
And it's a natural urge that we want to be taken care of, that we look for refuge from danger to things larger than ourselves, that we want to merge with something larger than ourselves. First it's the family, and then it's, maybe that one world government. So I think it's a natural human urge. But I think in the last 40 years, the ability of people to use data to argue that there's been no economic progress in the United States has persuaded a lot of people that I think, as many listeners know, I'm skeptical about, that there's a lot of other information out there. So it's true we have work to do still, as always.
I'd like to conclude with a poem, if you don't mind.
Well, I want you to conclude with a poem, Bob, but before you do, I want you to say something about poetry generally.
Poetry and poems, well, carefully selected, has the ability to emotionalize an idea in a way that the poem I want to read, I would hope, would almost bring chills to people, and do so in the context of making a very serious point about free market capitalism. And so I'm always looking for poems that have that element to it, that I can use them to point out. One I read is Hay to the Horses, and the guy that bucked hay, and he said, I started bucking hay when I was 16. I sure would hate to do that all my life, and damn it, that's just what I've gone and done. Well, then I raise with students, I say, now, do you believe him? Did he really hate bucking hay that much? He claims he did, but what did he do in life? Well, he bucked hay. So I've got to believe that at least he might have had various thoughts about, well, I'd love to do something else, but it never rose to the point level where he liked enough about bucking the hay and the outdoors and all of that he just hung in there. So and then I started reading poems at business lunches and business meetings. I mean, right in the middle of the discussion. And Rob Long has now stolen that from me. We had a retirement party a few years ago, and they got people to record a few comments. And he said, Bob, I have to admit to you that I have stolen your idea. Because he said, I now read poems at dinners and at lunches.
Sweet.
It surprises people. Part of it is there's the surprise factor, but it brings to bear powerful communication approach, powerful rhetoric in the form of a poem that you can't duplicate in a strictly prose sense. And
it's like a picture's worth 1,000 words. A poem can be worth 10,000 if it's,
Exactly. And by the way, I somewhat challenge that. I say, suggest to me a picture that would even come close to having the impact of the word mom. I mean, you just can't. Mom is such or dad, other things. But let me share this poem with you because I think it illustrates what I've been trying to explain. And the point that I use it to make is free market capitalism creates the discretionary income that allows for human diversity and the arts and culture to flourish. Now, you can accomplish the same thing if you want to live in a city-state with the Medicis being your dictators. Yeah. You can accomplish it in the Soviet Union where they contract with people to do art. Anyone that spends any time looking at that art knows how unsuccessful that is. You can do it like FDR did, where you commission people to go out and do films and stuff. And again, the result is not of the highest order. But here is a poem by Ted Kooser called A Box of Pastels that I think absolutely grabs at the notion that our lives are so much better off because of that aspect of human creativity, and that can only flourish if you have a prosperous enough society that people can afford to devote themselves to that. I once held on my knees a simple wooden box in which a rainbow lay dusty and broken. It was a set of pastels that had years before belonged to the painter, Mary Cassatt, and all of the colors she'd used in her work lay open before me. Oh, those hues she'd most used, the peaches and pinks, were worn down to the stubs, while the cool colors, violet, ultramarine, had been set, scarcely touched, to one side. She'd had little patience with darkness, and her heart held only a measure of shadow. I touched the warm dust of those colors, her tools, and left there with light on the tips of my fingers.
My guest today has been Robert Chitester. Bob, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.